In the past month, while prepping this video, I've learned that a lot of people love traffic lights. There is this huge romantic subculture dedicated to them, and I'm not just talking about weirdos like this guy. It's also people like Tony, whose idea of a man cave is absolute colorblind nightmare fuel. So for all the Tonys out there, I am neither a traffic engineer nor an enthusiast, and I am approaching this simply from the colorblind angle. So if you think I'm out of line on something, well, to throw up an amber signal and let me know down in the comments. Today on Chromophobe, let's look at one of the worst parts about driving colorblind, especially for the Dutans, the traffic lights. Last time I talked about driving on this channel, it was more about are colorblind people worse drivers, or rather, do we get into more accidents? Controlled studies showed that colorblind people should theoretically be worse drivers, but the real life data showed that we don't actually get into more accidents. And this is probably due to cautious adaptation, where colorblind drivers compensate for their deficiency by being instinctively safer drivers. Even if we did get into more accidents, that doesn't mean that we are worse drivers. It just means that the rules of the road and the technology are not set up in a way that are accessible to colorblindness. It doesn't have to be that way though. So in this video, I want to redesign a traffic light such that it doesn't suck, or at least doesn't significantly disadvantage colorblind people. Now, if you don't remember how traffic lights work, let's allow fellow colorblind icon Mr. Rogers to remind us all.
A green light says you can go. It says you may go when you see the green light. And a yellow light says, be careful, be careful. And a red light means stop.
Now, while that video is absolutely dripping in irony, I mean, that's a pretty good looking traffic light. Like, I think that could be a pretty good place that we could start. So first step in designing our new light, let's just get rid of colors. I mean, if Einstein can drive without colors, so can everyone else. So we take the top light, the stoplight, and we make that into an octagon because, like, obviously, right? Then we superimpose emojis onto each one of the lights to really sell their meaning. We take the stoplight and we blow that up to be much larger such that it's more intense and therefore more noticeable. We add signs to the side of the light to really say what each one means, because you can't see those at night. We then have to add a stoplight that's shining onto that sign. We have the red light flash at 3 hertz, the green light flash at 5 hertz, and the yellow light flash at 6 hertz. That's the number of times that the light flashes each second is equal to the number of letters in the word that used to represent that light.
Wow, this is the worst traffic light ever.
Yeah, no, this is actually the worst stoplight. Like, who greenlit this? Mine's a close second, though. And before we get carried away again, maybe let's take a peek at the literature, because this great paper from 1988 actually evaluates how different signal types, including color, can be applied to traffic and how they measure up to each other in terms of being robust, inexpensive, quickly interpretable, distinguishable from a distance, and accessible to as many people as possible. And of all the signaling types that the authors could imagine, color was by far the best, excelling in the first 4 categories and beating out other signals such as lamp order, intensity, flashing frequency, words, patterns, and shapes, etc., and really only losing out in that 5th category. And despite this paper coming from Vingris and Cole, the very pair who tried to ban protons from commercial driving, this paper is actually pretty legit. So I agree with all the conclusions and would say that we would be stupid for not including color as the primary signal in traffic lights. But I mean, why did we choose red, amber, and green anyways, or standard traffic lights? They seem to be chosen specifically to be as inaccessible to red-green colorblind people as possible. Why didn't we choose, like, better colors, you know, like amber, indigo, and actual green, not this stupid cyan? Well, red was chosen as stop for a reason, but for what is probably the world's strongest cultural color association, we don't actually know what that reason is. But there was a reason. Here are several of them. The road industry actually adopted the system of colors from the signal lights used for trains, where they had actually been using colored lanterns to communicate since before 1850. Red is a color that has intrinsically conveyed the meaning of danger since at least as far back as the Romans, whose own red association stemmed from the red color of the planet Mars, named after the god of war, ergo, danger. Others may argue that we are actually genetically hard-coded to instinctually relate red to danger because red is the natural color of blood, fire, and communism. Red is also the color most likely to be used by poisonous animals. Incidentally, and fittingly, yellow is the next most common color to be used by poisonous animals. Likewise, if we look at berries, yellow berries are almost always poisonous. Red berries are poisonous about 50% of the time, but if we look on the other side of the spectrum, blueberries are almost always edible, and green berries are actually usually very small limes. Some experiments in the literature show that the sudden appearance of the color red actually leads to faster reaction times than other colors, although this definitely wasn't known in the 1830s when the trains first made this color association. Maybe the most obvious reason, at least to you color normals, is that red has the most contrast with colors that are likely to be behind the signal. So this would be blue as in the sky, green as in foliage, or if you live in Canada, white. However, probably the most compelling explanation is the physical one, that red light resists Rayleigh scattering. This is the same phenomenon that causes the sky to look blue, but also allows red light to be seen from a further distance and to penetrate through thicker fog. Now, if I were to try to come up with reasons why we should use, say, indigo as stop, well, I would have the colorblind angle, and that's about it. And despite stop signs being yellow in the US from 1922 to 1954 before changing to red, which people obviously got used to, changing all of the traffic lights around the world is probably not an easy task. And people have definitely tried throughout history. As early as 1923, during the initial rollout of traffic lights, American engineers discovered that 10% of American males were colorblind, seeing both red and green as gray. And despite that nauseating take on colorblindness, we will give them a pass because they actually made a pretty good attempt at colorblind advocacy by proposing we substitute red lights for blue. At the time, with only 500 traffic lights operating around the world, it would have been a good time. However, detractors feared losing the 2 or 3 years of hard work educating the public on the meaning of this color system, not thinking the public would be able to adapt. And they also felt that waffling on something as fundamental to the system as the colors would undermine the credibility of this young technology. So instead, the detractors proposed, let's just ban all the colorblind people from driving, which, God, that's like a really unfortunate theme to this channel. Indeed, it would have been a good time to change the colors of traffic lights compared to nowadays, where there are millions of traffic lights worldwide. And good luck changing a system that is predicated on uniformity being much more important than optimization. Several more attempts were made over the next few decades to try and change the colors of traffic lights to be nice to colorblind people, but probably the most interesting attempt to change the color of traffic lights actually happened in China during the Cultural Revolution. The Maoists, known as the Red Guard, proposed changing the color scheme of traffic lights such that the red light would mean go, purely for the symbology of their movement. But even one of the most radical groups of modern times could not overcome that already ingrained attitude that red simply means stop. But one country resisted the standardization of traffic lights. The land of the rising sun simply refused to go with the flow of traffic. The story here is a super interesting dive into the language of color, but a little bit too much of a tangent for this video, so I will put it in a future episode, as long as I can get over my petrified feelings of pronouncing Japanese names on video. Suffice to say that the borders between colors in the Japanese language fall on very different parts of the color wheel. If we look at this comparison of English and Japanese, we can see that there is no simple one-to-one mapping of an English color to a Japanese color, and especially in the region between blue and green, the cyan area, they are completely different. In fact, the difference between blue and green in Japanese is historically not a very important one, which led to a lot of traffic lights in Japanese having a go, which was a very obvious blue. So I'm just saying, like, if Japan had won World War II, at least traffic lights would have been like way easier for people like me. By the mid-70s, some important international standards came out that started to describe the acceptable range of red, amber, and green colors mathematically, such that Japan could no longer hide behind mistranslation and started to slowly replace all of their blue lights into the classic green. I mean slowly, because you can still find today token blue traffic lights scattered across the country. Japan never had a problem with the red traffic light though, because after all, the red traffic light is emblazoned on their national flag. Christ, can you imagine if like every country just used their flag's colors as the traffic light colors? Well, sure, you'd have places like Mali and Guinea, which wouldn't have to change much, even though that would be a pretty confusing border to cross over. You'd have people like the Belgians who would never go anywhere, which is an apt description of their national politics. And then you'd have the Nigerians who would live fast and die young. So we're stuck with colored traffic lights, and we're stuck with the colors that we have. But that doesn't mean we can't supplement the color with a secondary signal. For example, stop signs use red as the primary signal, but also the secondary signals of the shape, the octagon, and a word, stop. So let's go through these other 6 signal types that the 1988 paper found to be so inferior to color, and see if we can incorporate them into our design as a little something on the side. After color, the second most significant signal is order, as in the relative position between the red, amber, and green lights. Now, this has been consistent since at least 1949 internationally, and so is a critical piece of information for colorblind people to try and decipher what a traffic light is saying. Some colorblind people rely on mnemonics, such as top is stop, low is go, or in my case, RAG, red, amber, green, as we're approaching a traffic light, and recite it in our head just to make sure that we're interpreting it as we should. Which just goes to show that this light position can never have that deep relationship to meaning that color has to meaning, because after all, none of you approach a traffic light, especially color normals, reciting green means go in your head in case you might forget something so basic. So when India starts to roll out these postmodern lights where the entire pole is lit with a signal color, it leaves a lot of Redditors thinking, cool, then why do we still need those classic triplet lights? Well, because order is super important to colorblind drivers, who thankfully now exist in India, thanks to them overturning a ban on colorblind driving just last year. The order is actually one of the most successful and important standards in the world, which is why it's so disappointing when some states and provinces in the US and Canada think they can get away with this crappy 5-light vertical. Like, no, Minnesota, you ain't pulling that off. It's like when my dad thought that this light switch would be a good idea and didn't take the hint when he went to Home Depot and could only find these plates that were 3 switches long. Like, preserve that positional information and you don't have to put labels on them. Luckily, most American states have taken to replacing these long strings of lights with a doghouse arrangement. And in Japan, whenever you need a 4th or 5th light, such as a protected left green arrow, you hang that below the sacred triplet to preserve that critical positional information. Speaking of Japan, US, and Canada, these are actually the only 3 countries to routinely allow horizontal traffic lights, which are banned in most countries. Interestingly enough, the horizontal traffic lights also follow that same order, red, amber, green, but in right-hand traffic countries like the US, that order is from left to right, and in left-hand traffic countries like Japan, that order is from right to left. So if you ever find yourself driving in Japan, do not always be looking out for those blue traffic lights. They will not help you. Of course, any of these orders only really make sense when you are able to see where your light lies in relation to the triplet. At night, depending on the light, that can often be quite impossible, and that's before the moon conspires to kill you. But luckily, there's a pretty obvious solution for overcoming this. Most British traffic lights are in the form of a sighting board, where a black light will be fashioned with a white border. This makes the position much more obvious. Recently, they have been replacing this white border with a retroreflective border, which really makes the position pop and really improves the visibility of the order at night. When Kentucky implemented the same, they found that the number of total collisions at the upgraded lights dropped by 15%. And just street viewing around Kentucky, I gotta say, I was expecting a lot more KFCs. And let's not give Kentucky too much credit on this otherwise great implementation. After all, as I was street viewing around the state, most of what I ran into were variations of this monstrosity, which I guess those retroreflective borders were just encroaching on their freedom to get into collisions. Another concept that I have never seen implemented, but I discovered on an old message board, was to take LED lights and always leave the outer ring on. That way you always see the 3 circles, but one of them is filled and therefore much brighter, so it's obvious which light you should be following. I think this is probably easy to implement, and maybe some existing controllers can already handle this kind of granularity on which LEDs are lit up. And I would be very curious to see if this sort of thing would help in real life. Order wasn't always so important in traffic lights, though. When traffic lights were first introduced in the 1920s, one of the most popular forms was to have 2 bulbs in total. The top and bottom bulb would alternate, such that when the top bulb was on, it would be sending out 4 signals in all directions, such that 2 of the directions would get green light, 2 of the directions would get a red light, and then they would switch. This meant that in the one direction, say on the main street, red would be on top, but the cross street would have to have green on top. It wasn't until a decade later, when 4, 8, or 12 bulb traffic lights became feasible, that you could really standardize that order, and red became always on top. Nowadays, this order is so consistent that when just one intersection digresses, it is a huge deal. During the early years of traffic lights, one intersection in Syracuse, New York, suffered a certain string of vandalism. This traffic light on Tipperary Hill became the target of Irish youth who would use their slingshots to break the lights. The reason? They were offended that the British red was above the Irish green. Eventually, after replacing it many times, the local alderman convinced the city to replace it with an inverted light with green on top. The vandalism stopped, and that light exists to this day. But the legacy of this thing is totally bonkers. In the 1970s, the now 70-year-old vandals were ceremoniously exonerated by the mayor and were honored with the position of Grand Marshals in the St. Patrick's Day Parade. In the 90s, the community raised enough money to build a park at the intersection, including a life-size bronze statue to memorialize these brave sons of Ireland who stood up to City Hall. The same City Hall that at the time was largely Irish-dominated, but whatever. And nowadays, this inverted traffic light is a perennial icon on websites like Etsy, where you can pick up t-shirts or jewelry or prints of this middle finger to the colorblind community. It just baffles me how some American communities can be so nationalistic of their heritage 100 years on, and yet in Ireland itself, they put red on the top of the traffic light like the rest of the frickin' world. So honestly, Tipperary Hill, don't you have like something else to be proud of? Like some B-list celebrity that grew up there, or some varsity rugby team that won state? No? Nothing? Christ, even this Etsy print postulates, what would Tipperary Hill be without the green on top light? I don't know, irrelevant? Anyway, to summarize, we definitely need to keep order and incorporate that into our traffic light design, if nothing else to piss off Tipperary Hill. And if I have any colorblind viewers watching from Syracuse, links to slingshots are in the description. Signal type number 3 is intensity, or how bright a light is. And believe it or not, this was once used as the primary signal for controlling traffic on a road. In the 1930s, Philadelphia police positioned a searchlight on the top of City Hall at the end of the main street. Their idea was that they would simply blind drivers that they wanted to stop. They called this HIT, high intensity interval torching. But I'm way too fat to be making exercise jokes. Theoretically, intensity could be used to differentiate between red and green lights, such that you take the red light, pump up the intensity so that when you see an intense light, it's probably red. And according to this ad, that would decrease all accidents at the intersection by 50%, though I find that very hard to believe. Problem with intensity is it's not exactly a fail-safe design. Plus, protans naturally see green as brighter and deutans see red as brighter, so it would be hard to really calibrate that to colorblind viewers. So this is probably a dead end, but as we discussed in the last video, it's still very important that reds are overall brighter such that protans can see them, they're more noticeable. Signal type number 4 is frequency, such as how fast is a light flashing. Now, people in North America are no stranger to flashing lights. Where a solid red light means stop and don't continue, a flashing red light means stop and continue while safe. However, I've seen no implementations where the actual frequency of that flashing conveys different meanings. I think it does have a use though. One of the hardest things for colorblind drivers in North America is to differentiate the amber from the red flashing lights when they are at an intersection that otherwise has no positional information to help us tell what that light is. But maybe if yellow lights flash once per second and red lights flash twice per second, that would be distinct enough of a signal to help colorblind drivers differentiate the two, yet wouldn't pose too much of a distraction to color normal drivers. It would be a pretty interesting niche solution, but of course it doesn't apply to the traffic light that we're designing right now, which is a standard red, amber, green traffic light, not one of these flashing rural traffic lights. A different kind of flashing might be useful though, and I don't mean a white light flashing stop in Morse code. In the 90s, the US prototyped with red traffic lights that were supplemented with a strobe light that would flash quite quickly simply to grab the attention of drivers. As someone who has to continuously scan for red lights over the horizon, this seems like a great idea to catch my attention, and some anecdotal evidence online suggests that these things are in fact amazing and decrease collisions. Yet, the US has since banned them, stating that they have evidence that these do not have any effect on the number of collisions at intersections, which, I mean, I'm very skeptical, but you can't really argue with data. Because I can't see what that data is, I would still like to see this sort of thing applied in a different country in real life, then maybe it would work there. But nothing suggests that we should incorporate this into our light. Signal type number 5 is orientation, namely semaphore arms. Now I mentioned that the railways first used colored lights, but for the first 100 years, the lights weren't really intense enough to work very well during the day, so they had these redundant semaphore arms to carry the same meaning, such that horizontal meant stop or caution, vertical meant proceed, and diagonal meant something in between. Semaphore arms are still used very commonly around the world, but because mechanical systems are not quite as robust as electrical systems, they're often reimagined, such as for trams, who need to use colorless signals that drivers of cars don't mistake for their own. Anyway, a good general rule of thumb is that if a traffic light confuses you, it is probably not for you, and you can safely ignore it. But I am not a lawyer. The extrapolation of that is this 3x3 matrix that can mimic all of those light positions and more. The Dutch call this their nekenoog, which I am only saying because my wife hates when I try to speak Dutch. Nekenoog literally means 9 eyes, which makes sense considering that this thing has 9 bulbs, but I will warn you, absolutely do not put this name into Google and look at the images, because... This very idea was actually a serious proposal in the 1920s to replace the very new colored traffic lights, however, was quickly nipped in the bud, mainly for the fact that 36 light bulbs is way more expensive than 2 or 3. These 3x3 patterns work with buses or trams in high-density areas where traffic never really gets going that quickly, and so therefore clarity is more important than stopping time. But that paper from 1988 definitely showed that pattern is one of the worst performers when it comes to stopping quickly, and therefore this isn't something I can put into our traffic light design. Let's be honest though, a 9-pixel display is so 1965. Nowadays we could have 4K traffic lights and get them sponsored by LG. And that opens up so many possibilities when it comes to signal type number 5, or patterns. In 2008, a pair of engineers installed their new idea for a traffic light at an intersection in Asunción, Paraguay. It used the standard red, amber, green colors to denote their classical meanings, but because it was made of LEDs, also used redundant patterns using an X for the red light and using a vertical line for the green light. The pilot only lasted a few weeks before the government found out about it and took it down. They find out later that the light had never actually been tested in a controlled setting to see if it helps, and motorists were not actually ever informed for how they should interpret this thing or if it even applied to them, and so they listened to that one guy on the internet that said that you can just ignore lights that confuse you. I mean, thanks for trying to help the colorblind, but maybe next time, test it first. And this signal light soon faded into obscurity, probably because it didn't have a catchy name like Duitsendorf. Once we have LEDs though, we can get super creative, and we all know that super standardized traffic lights are a perfect outlet for creativity. This idea takes advantage of LED's ability to be finely animated to give drivers real-time meta information to let them know exactly how much more candy they can crush before the light turns green. Plus it's super cool, right? Well, this pattern not only disrupts that positional information that we've grown so accustomed to, but because it changes so drastically, it would actually be difficult for someone like me scanning the horizon to pick out this light, much more so than just the classic standardized silhouette of a triplet traffic light. Plus, damn, so expensive and illegal in the US. Not in China though, where they have got countdown timers everywhere. Some of them are quite reasonable and others are downright terrible. This progress bar style light, popular in Tianjin, doesn't really give much for Dutans to work with in terms of color, and these arrow style lights seem like a pretty compelling idea, but I mean, how exactly are colorblind people supposed to use this? Well, they aren't, because you forget that China's solution to colorblind drivers is for them to walk, because they can't drive in China at all. Oh, China. The country that thought it was a good idea to put a sculpture of traffic lights at the side of a road with the reasoning, oh, the junction looked bare. They looked very pretty at night, but drivers should just ignore them. And China, what the f is this? This helps nobody. Which brings us to signal type number 6, adding redundant alphanumeric signals, and by that I mean words. As you can see in these traffic lights, it's actually quite easy to incorporate words like stop and go into the lights. And actually, these were quite necessary in the early days before drivers really learned their color associations. Then why do we get rid of them? Why don't we have lights like this that tell people to siga? Well, because it doesn't really add much and really just starts to obfuscate that important positional information. The main problem is probably language when it comes to trying to standardize traffic lights around the world. I mean, just look at stop signs. All European countries use the English word stop on their stop signs, and this includes countries where their languages are based on completely different alphabets. Their drivers have learned to memorize this word, not as a word, but as a complex symbol. But if you're already relying on learned symbology of a word, why not just have a more universal and simpler symbol as your stop symbol? Something like a cross or a plus or a maple leaf, and damn, that looks great. But just comparing these two, which of these do you think you would be able to differentiate from a further distance? But all we're really doing right now is changing the shape of lights, so let's just look at signal type number 7, shapes. We actually already use shapes as redundant signals for traffic lights worldwide, for pedestrian traffic. Now these lights must obviously be shaped differently so that they're not confused by motorists, but even having that walking person versus the standing person or the hand is already very useful for a colorblind person to be sure that you're interpreting it correctly. But it's not only the shapes that differ, and maybe this was blindingly obvious to a lot of you color normals, but if we pull up the chromaticity diagram from earlier that defines all the colors, you may have noticed right in the middle of the amber and red is Portland orange. Apparently all don't walk signs in North America are not red or amber, but this Portland orange in between color, which, if you say so. Anyway, shapes are already used as motorist traffic control, usually in the form of green arrows. And we've also seen in some regions that all green lights are represented by arrows, which is something that I quite like and would like to introduce into our design. In the late 90s, Texas tried prototyping something called the Unilight system, which used shaped lights, a circle for green, a triangle for yellow, and an octagon for red, which is a tempting choice, but really a bad one because an octagon and a circle are way too damn similar, especially in this example image. I first saw a circle and didn't even notice the octagon. And because the Unilight was utilizing some of the first LED traffic lights available, they thought just because they can stack all of these symbols on top of each other, they should stack them all on top of each other, which of course we already know is a terrible idea. So Unilight sucks, but what about Unisignal from 2009? It's a much better and more subtle concept, but despite the name evoking universality, these couldn't be used in any but the simplest intersections because they had no solution for handling protected lefts. Plus, I found the shapes rather counterintuitive. I would have thought that the triangle would have been associated with a forward arrow and therefore applied to the green light, or would have been associated with a yield or caution sign and therefore applied to the yellow light, but not red. I did a video recently on the color ad system, so let's look at how color ad fares with traffic lights. Well, they get quite lucky off the get-go, to be honest, because their yellow symbol is a diagonal line, which resembles perfectly the diagonal semaphore, which carries the exact same meaning. But when you look at the red light, which is kind of like a symbol with a forward-facing arrow, look, we already know color ad is not useful for much. So let's fast forward to a good implementation. One of the most extensive rollouts of shaped traffic lights in history was actually in Eastern Canada. They used to be ubiquitous in the 90s, but the Quebec Ministry of Transportation started to phase them out because they found them to be redundant. Yes, that is the point. Nowadays, I was only able to find these lights in the city of Sherbrooke and in the mini province of Prince Edward Island, but in both of these regions, they are everywhere and they are beautiful. So let's break them down. As far as the shapes, the reds are squares, the greens are circles, and the yellows are diamonds, which not only are pretty easy to distinguish from each other, but also don't carry any counterintuitive symbology. The lights are also always arranged horizontally. The red lights are larger, and there are two of them, which means that the red light is much, much brighter than the yellow light. The red lights are also arranged on the extremes of the signal, such that you never have to remember whether the red is on the left side or the right side. Plus, because they're always on at the same time, you always have this pattern, which is amazingly simple and distinguishable, and one of the most useful features of this light. In its simple four-light form, this signal is brilliant. They do have issues when they're introducing left and right turn arrows, which they do by making, instead of 4 lights, 5 or 6 lights in a row, which still works for the most part, but I think they could improve on it. Now, I would rather see them adopt the hanging protected left that Japan uses. I think that would be quite easy, so you always conserve that sacred quadruplet of lights, as well as using a retroreflective border. There's no reason you can't install that here. And maybe instead of a green ball or a green circle, to use a bold green ring if that green is intended for all directions, or simply just to stick with directional green arrows. But other than that, I mean, this traffic light it's basically the best thing I can imagine. This light takes color, position, pattern, shape, and intensity all into account in its redundant signaling. And according to one colorblind Prince Edward Islander that I talked to about this, it is as great in practice as I like to think it is in theory. Anyway, I'm not one to dwell on a good thing, so let's look at some completely different solutions. One thing that might be easier than trying to change all the traffic lights around the world is simply to give assistive devices to the colorblind. In 40 of 50 American states, even achromats are allowed to drive, and they see no color, plus have much lower visual acuity and general day blindness. And all they need to drive are some special binoculars, some red-tinted lenses, and enough training on how to use them. Even better, a patent from 2005 basically uses a digital camera attached to the front of the car to detect traffic lights while you're driving, to amplify them to a display inside the car, to correct the colors based on your specific kind of color blindness, all of which allow you to determine the color of that traffic light. And the patent is right, that computers are definitely the future when it comes to handling traffic signals, but it clings on to this whole let's help the colorblind see color design fallacy, when really we should just be circumventing color. Actually, we can just circumvent the colorblind people too when autonomous vehicles are finally popularized, but those vehicles will not be using colored traffic lights. They will be using a non-visual means of communication like 5G. Now clearly, self-driving cars pretty much solve all problems when it comes to colorblind people interpreting signal lights because they don't have to interpret them at all. Of course, if you're one of those people who still wants to drive, that's still not a problem because in my perfect utopian future, you will not need to interpret red, amber, green traffic lights. Instead, your car will receive that 5G signal from the traffic control, and then car will know based on your own proclivities, your own settings, and your own color blindness, that it can give you a visual, audible, tactile, or even olfactory signal to tell you that, smells like stop. And I know, this also kind of seems like a cop-out to say, in the future we'll evolve past stoplights, but some countries have actually already evolved past stoplights. For example, look at North Korea, who for generations has put off the adoption of traffic lights in favor of offering jobs to the comeliest of their lasses. Now, if you look at this recent picture of a traffic controller in Pyongyang, you might think, oh no, that traffic light is going to take her job. Or you might realize there are no cars in this picture in this intersection, only 23 people in the background waiting for a bus. Oh, North Korea, never change. Okay. For a better example, where I am from in North America, a one stoplight town is a disparaging moniker for a town with only a few hundred people that's too small to be interesting. But where I live now in Switzerland, in a town of 17,000 people, I have precisely 0 stoplights here. And that is mostly because since 1987, Switzerland has been on the path of replacing stoplights with roundabouts. And if you look at a comparison between roundabouts and traffic lights, for almost all intersection types, the roundabout is the clear winner. And that's because, for 3 reasons, they are much safer, fewer collisions and fewer deaths per collision. They have a much higher flow, more cars through per hour, and each car gets through faster on average, as well as a lower cost. There are no maintenance costs associated with it, and pretty much no chance of failure of a roundabout. The comparison between roundabouts and traffic lights is covered pretty exhaustively in other YouTube videos, but to emphasize here that roundabouts are completely accessible to the colorblind. Now, one way you might interpret this is that when you take away hurdles for colorblind people, collisions drastically decrease. And you might think, well, that's proof that colorblind people were causing all of the collisions in traffic light controlled intersections. And if that's what you want to believe, fine. But just remember that it is not only good for colorblind people, but everyone to make this transition from traffic light controlled intersections to roundabout intersections. What I really want to emphasize here is that when you are challenged to redesign a product to be more accessible to colorblind people, you are already pitching yourself into a very small subset of solutions. Just like I discussed in my color ad video. When you're trying to design a new thing, the correct question is not how can we help colorblind people see color, but rather how can we redesign this thing such that it is better for everybody. And in the end, better for everybody will generally include also being colorblind accessible. This is Chromophobe.